bad way to start out. Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to this special event put on by the National Association of Scholars. Our special event is concerned with a report that just came out. I just want to mention a few words about its context first before I introduce our panelists and we jump in. The National Association of Scholars is very concerned with the penetration of what we call DEI ideology or DEI ideology into all aspects of our lives, in particular higher education. And one of the curious things about this ideology and how it's penetrated into the sciences is that the scientists have long thought they were immune from this, that they were somehow isolated from it. And our report tonight shows quite convincingly that no, that was a bit of a ostrich head in the sand attitude. In fact, it's been going on for a long time and it's extensive. And I think we are all alarmed with that. The report is it's entitled Ideological Intensification. The authors are Mason Goad, who is on the screen with you. Mason is a research associate here at National Association of Scholars. He and I both work on the Intrusion and Diversity in the Sciences program. He's a graduate of North Georgia University and University of North Georgia, and was for a time at George Mason University and is pursuing graduate studies now. Our other panelists are Nathan Honeycutt. Welcome, Nathan. You're the first. This is your first time with us. Nathan is a psychologist. He's currently working at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Among other things, he has a PhD from Rutgers University in psychology, and he works on issues of bias and in surveys and those sorts of things. And we'll put up the links to biographical pages for all of our panelists momentarily. Excuse me. And our third panelist is Luana Maroja. She is a professor of biology and chair of biochemistry and molecular biology at Williams College. She's a native of Brazil and has a PhD from down the road where I live, Cornell University. And she has been a rather fierce and outspoken critic of the spread of DEI ideology in the sciences. So with that, let's jump right in. We're going to start with a presentation from Nathan for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for a panel discussion with all of us. We'll see where that goes. We encourage you to put questions in for us to look at. We'll go to questions and answers about 45 minutes in or so, and please put them in the Q&A box, not chat. The Q&A box gives us some tools to help moderate the discussion a little bit better. So welcome everyone. Welcome Luana. Welcome Nathan. We're glad you're here. And Mason, take it away.
Right. Well, welcome everyone. As Dr. Turner mentioned, my name is Mason Goad. I was one of the two co-authors for Ideological Intensification, and this is the largest quantitative study of DEI in the sciences to date. What this study consisted of was the collection of over 280,000 files and over 30 gigabytes of data. We created 5 original data sets of DEI and STEM, created 255 individual graphs across 35 figures, as well as an animated map. And in the interest of transparency, our data mining tools, the R code used for graphing and the raw data, as well as the clean data, have been made publicly available free of charge. Please consult the full report just to find details on how to access those resources. But I'm going to jump right in if I can figure out how to. There we go. All right. So the general hypothesis here is that if DEI ideology is intruding on the sciences, then we should use DEI-related language to track it as a proxy. And so what we're looking for is the co-occurrence of DEI-related language among STEM-related language on university websites. To do this, we gathered nearly 60,000 URLs from 100 American universities. These universities were chosen due to their STEM-focused research and education, or being the most prominent. And they were distributed across the United States, as you'll soon see. From these universities, we were looking for the co-occurrence of a DEI term from a dictionary we created, a STEM term from another dictionary we created, and then a single specified date. And if all three of those were met, then we were able to pinpoint the date of creation for that web page and then graph it. And here's what that graph looks like. This is the mention of both STEM and DEI terms on all university websites over time. And this trend line that you see here is rather familiar to us by the end of this study. From 2010 to 2015, there wasn't much in the way of activity. From 2015 to 2020, we see increasing activity. And then in 2020, there was an explosion of activity, almost certainly as a consequence of George Floyd's death and the subsequent Black Lives Matter riots that year. It has not decreased, as you can see there, going into 2021. By the end of data collection, this has not slowed down. If anything, it's only sped up. We can look at specific DEI-related terms alongside all STEM-related terms. And again, this same pattern appears to hold. There's not much activity in the first half of the last decade, increasing activity in the second half of the last decade, and then an explosion of activity after the summer of 2020. Here's the animated map. This shows the geographic locations of all of the universities we've surveyed. And those individual smaller red rings is a single co-occurrence of a DEI term and a STEM term being found on a university webpage with a single specified date at that particular institution. So as we can see, this begins in California and the Northeast, which we might expect. But then we had to check ourselves because we had to get rid of about 90% of the data in the university websites, most of which simply contained multiple dates, so we couldn't graph it. In doing so, we decided to look at university Twitter feeds and to build a second data set, because if the sciences, the scientific education and research being taught in the universities if DEI language is rising in the university community, the scientific facet that's found within the universities will be subject to it and be intruded on. So in order to do this and create this data set, we use the Google JSON API to identify 895 unique Twitter accounts. 100 of them were the main Twitter accounts of the universities, and 795 were related accounts, such as alumni associations and departments, schools, and so on. In doing so, we collected over 150,000 tweets from these 100 universities and their communities, and those tweets make up the data set. We see similar patterns here in all tweets of DEI as we did in the web pages. There's not much activity from 2010 to 2015, but it's slowly and slightly increasing. There's an increased level of activity after 2015, and then an explosion of interest in the summer of 2020. This graph charts the same thing, but these are only the 100 university primary accounts to make the picture a little clearer. And then we can look at individual terms as they show up in tweets. And as you can see, there are certain words such as advocacy, ally, and so on that appear to almost oscillate where no trend can be discerned. But others such as anti-racism, BLM, and critical race theory had practically no activity whatsoever until the summer of 2020 and have continued on, not completely falling off, even though I know it's stretched out, so it's a little bit difficult to see. After exhausting the universities, we had to look elsewhere because the universities only contain one aspect of the Western civilization scientific enterprise within the United States as well. In order to do that, we looked at the professional associations, and we chose these four based on their size and the financial resources that they have, the membership size and financial resources. We pulled all of this data here. So from the American Physical Society, representing the field of physics, we pulled their March and April annual scientific meetings from 2007 to 2021. The Chemical Society, representing chemistry. We pulled the biannual scientific meetings from 2015 to 2019. Mathematics, we got their scientific abstracts from 2008 to 2021. And then the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology was a little bit tricky. Instead, we chose to use their newsletter, their internal newsletter going from 2002 to 2021, 225 individual PDFs. We then scanned these PDFs looking for DEI terms. There was no need to look for STEM terms because of the people that were putting these out, of course, were STEM focused anyway. And our results here were mixed. So these are the DEI related terms as absolute counts. And as you can see, sometimes the trend, there's growth in usage of DEI terms. Sometimes it's negative and sometimes it's, well, no trend can really be discerned. Here's the proportional counts. And again, the same problem emerges where we're not entirely sure if the trends are going up or down or staying stagnant. But what we are certain of is that each of these four associations has incorporated DEI into their organizational structure in some fashion. That fashion usually is in the form of a committee of sorts, but we can still definitively conclude that DEI has encroached on this aspect of science as well. We then turn to scientific funding, because if DEI was truly encroaching on the sciences and intruding into them, we would expect the funding dollars to be diverted away from sciences and toward DEI-related projects. In order to test this, we collected the full award data from 2010 to 2021 of the National Science Foundation, approximately 140,000 awards. We conducted 9 targeted searches of the database of the National Institutes of Health, and we pulled the full historical award data of the Ford Foundation, which is approximately 24,000 entries. This is a little bit more clear, as you can tell, compared to the academic associations. This is all DEI terms and all NSF grants by year in terms of absolute counts going from 2010 to the end of 2021. And as you can see, it's a fairly steady increase. But this is the absolute counts, and what we're really interested in is the amount of funding dollars that is going to DEI. So here's the number of NSF grant funding that's going to DEI related projects. As you can see at the start there in 2021, we're at about $13 million. And by the end of the decade, that has risen almost 9 times, approaching $100 million and continuing to climb. This is the NIH search results. We see various increases in different words, but our familiar pattern emerges where there's not much activity prior or around 2010 to 2015, increases from 2015 to 2020, and then an explosion of interest thereafter. In the Ford Foundation, we were also able to look at their identified beneficiary populations. These include BIPOC, female, trans, and then track the level of funding dollars. And as you can see, by 2020, there was an explosion of interest, which appears to have now fallen for these specific projects as well. And finally, our 5th data set was on the scientific literature itself. And if DEI is truly encroaching on STEM, which it is, then we would expect to see it most clearly reflected in the scientific literature. In order to do this, we searched the databases of Web of Science, Google Scholar, Archive, and PubMed, the last of which is hosted by the National Institutes of Health, looking for specific DEI terms. In the Web of Science, our familiar pattern emerges, where there's not much activity at all until about 2015 and increases thereafter. We used, in this case, science, the keyword, as a control method, and you can see it in the middle of the right-hand side there. We're going, all topics of science were logged, and we were able to track that. And that gives us a control because we can see the trend line as compared to the other trend lines. And so we can tell that this is not just a normal increase. This have been abrupt changes only over the past 7 years or so. In Google Scholar, we did the same thing. we used power posing there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Some of you might remember there was something of a fad a few years ago called power posing, where essentially you stood like a superhero for a few minutes before giving a public speech, and it was supposed to help your confidence. Well, it was debunked and fell from grace, and no one talks about it anymore. And so we used that as a control method as we were searching Google Scholar, because if anything was going down, we would expect to see it, such as power posing, which is what we see with power posing. It goes up, it goes down after it was debunked. And looking at the other keywords, that's not the case. These have increased and they've remained increased, but we can be relatively certain that that is an accurate representation of their usage within the scientific literature hosted on Google Scholar. There was no need to use a control method in arXiv because the entire database is a preprint server for scientific literature. But interestingly, despite being the largest database, there's not as many data points here. Still, you can definitely tell that there is an increase in usage of DEI-related terms in this scientific literature database as well. And then last but not least, we have PubMed. This is longitudinal, so the first, pay attention to the x-axis here. The first time that the word occurs, though I'm somewhat suspicious about some of these very early appearances. The first time the word occurs is when the graph actually starts. And as we can see in terms of intersectionality, DEI and anti-racism and the others, there's practically no activity up until about 2015, where there's a slight rise and then a large spike around 2019, 2020, which is the same pattern we've seen elsewhere. So just to go over some of the conclusions of the study, in all the data sets, with the exception of the annual programs of professional associations, DEI has increased significantly over the past decade, exponentially so over the past few years. Out of the 100 universities we surveyed, DEI is being linked to STEM on university web pages approximately 26 times more frequently than it was 10 years ago. I didn't mention this exactly in this presentation because we are pressed for time, but I'd go into this in the full report. DEI ideology is actually more prominent at elite institutions. And as of 2021, DEI was, proportionally speaking, twice as prevalent among Ivy League colleges as non-Ivy League colleges. On Twitter, DEI or social justice related language has increased since 2015. And then the growth of DEI in annual programs is, of course, mixed. The NSF and NIH have diverted significantly more funding to DEI-related topics over the last few years. NSF funding to projects with anti-racist themes approximately tripled in 1 year alone, 2020 to 2021. And the number of DEI-related projects in the NIH grew significantly between 2010 to the present day, roughly 5 to 1,000 times, depending on the DEI term specifically. Between 2010 and 2021, the scientific publications and preprints grew as well with their usage of DEI 3 to 42 times faster than scientific topics in general in the Web of Science, and similar patterns are observed in Google Scholar and PubMed. The results on arXiv vary based on the DEI term or anti-racist term specifically, but there are increases there as well. And then finally, I would like to reiterate that all of our codes, the data mining tools, the raw data and the clean data are all publicly available, and to consult the study. There is still much more that could be explored here. And for example, in our next report on MIT, I took the Twitter data for that to create another graph. There are 99 other institutions of their Twitter data, individual Twitter data, that have yet to be graphed. So we welcome the public to continue exploring these data sets. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Turner. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mason. Just for information's sake, the PDF of the report is available for downloading on the registration page, and we'll be making this PowerPoint also available publicly sometime in the next few days. Okay, so thank you very much, Mason, for that kind of shocking report, if you will. I mean, we all kind of knew it was happening, but having it quantified is very, very helpful. So now we go to responses of our panelists. So Luana, why don't we start with you? Unmute, please. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, it's really good to have this quantified. And I think what everybody is wondering is what is the implication of this increase? What are the actions? How are things changing due to this DEI intrusion in sciences in particular, and in the colleges, and what are the practical aspects that come with that? And what I am concerned, so I think, like, if you think of efforts to increase diversity, increase inclusion, decrease racism, I think everybody is in favor of decreasing racism. Of course, we all want to decrease racism. Nobody would be against that. What the concern is can be well encapsulated in that quote that you put from Kamala Harris in the beginning, which is equity means we all end up the same. And for that to happen, you need to take actions. And it is some of these actions that concern me. So in terms of universities and colleges, for example, how, if one of the DEI goals is equity, and we know it is, and equity must be attained in order for DEI to be successful, how can you do that? We know that students are accepted with very different interests, cultural backgrounds, and grades. So how can you get equity if you have a heterogeneous population to start with? And of course, many of the strategies that are appearing, like, for example, self-grading or ungrading, contract grading now, a number of strategies that I am seeing fastly spreading in my college and other colleges lead to students getting all A's. So this is the fastest way for equity, is that everybody gets an A. And when everybody gets an A, the grades are meaningless. And what is worse is not even that, is that what really matters is learning. And people seem to forget that many students are motivated by grades. And when you give A's to everybody, they're no longer making an effort to continue learning. And with that, you increase gaps, you do not decrease gaps. The students that are the strongest students, most interested in actually learning, will continue to learn. The students that are not that interested in the subject and know they will get an A no matter what, especially in the cases of self-grading, they will not do anything. So in the end, much like we saw with grades in standardized tests at our schools all over the nation, what happens is that during the pandemic, we had not only classes on Zoom, which was a complete disaster, but also a number of anti-racism activities starting, and those anti-racist activities usually are activities that aim for equity and therefore for equity in grades. And the outcomes of that was an increase in the actual gap when kids take standardized tests. It didn't help anyone. So my greatest fear of this spreading DEI is that it hurts the very people they aim to protect. I was, in terms, moving on to the scientific societies, I was actually quite surprised by how little change there was. The only society that I attend meetings every year is the Society for the Study of Evolution. That is my society. And in that, I have seen a dramatic increase in DEI-related terms and actions. So my society now hires a consultant to prevent sexual harassment, for example. Of course, it assumes that there has been enough harassment to justify hiring an expensive consultant. And I will not go on whether this exists or not, but whether this is a solution to have someone walk among the conference or put in posters why sexual harassment is bad and whether this is worth the money. And of course, the negativity of that is that it it can make communication difficult. It is stifling to interactions between males and females. And I think another who gets hurt in the end, who gets hurt in the end are females, especially younger researchers that will be avoided by older male researchers. And I think this is happening. I've had several older colleagues that have told me personally that definitely they don't feel comfortable speaking to younger graduate students, for example. And it's another one of these initiatives that might seem good if you don't really think of the consequences, the unintended consequences of these sorts of things. At my societies, there are lots of talks now focusing on, or not focusing, perhaps you wouldn't see it at the title. So that's what I'm wondering, is whether I see these more on content or whether it would be in the titles of the talks. That would be what we would be able to get with the word searches and whatnot. But a lot of the talks this year were focusing on colonialism and colonialism in sciences and doing scientific work in third world countries and all that. And again, like if the solution to this colonialism is not to do work in third world countries, that would be extremely negative. If the solution is to increase work in third world country and make sure that everybody's involved so they can get an authorship or something, then that's great. So it depends on what the ultimate consequences of these efforts are. In terms of scientific literature, I am not at all surprised. I mean, we all see Nature and Science are publishing editorials pretty much every day, I think, with DEI ideology in it. And once again, calling for actions that oftentimes include things like expansion of what merit means. And if you read in between lines what these what these typically does or assumes is that we have to have other ways of measuring merit, which doesn't count what you're publishing or doesn't count what, and those are again I do not see a net good coming from that. Like if you say that merit now counts if you write an anti-racist paper, and that counts just as much as a scientific paper, or if you describe, I don't know, some facet of your identity, and that counts just like a scientific paper, I think you are holding not only science behind, but those scientists that are falling into that. This is not equivalent. So I don't know what else I have. I'll stop here and let Nathan talk.
Thank you, Luana. Okay, so Nathan, you have a particular perspective on this. You've worked in the social sciences, and now you're sort of been plunged feet first into fire at the forefront of this whole issue. So I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join in on this panel today. I have some kind of intermixed comments, both on the report, a little bit on DEI issues broadly, which will hopefully be useful and maybe help lead into our Q&A time and discussion. I think one of the main things lacking from conversations and debates about DEI and DEI initiatives in universities or in the academy broadly is the lack of relevant or helpful or useful data. This report certainly does contribute some helpful data to the conversation, and what I'm hopeful about too from this is that it will help serve as a springboard for additional studies and additional investigations. This kind of pool of data is massive, so hopefully other researchers will take advantage of the opportunity to dig into it and kind of look around and see what else can be found in there. I think it's helpful to have quantitative info behind the prevalence of DEI info in academic context, because people, and I'll include myself in this, often talk about how discussions around DEI is growing, and efforts and searches and DEI type hires for faculty and different things like that. It's increasing, but anecdotes face limitations. And so when you have some good quantitative data here, then you can say, all right, well, I have my anecdotes, but then here's some hard numbers that you can look at and dig into. I think the increase in DEI and funding particularly catches my attention. A lot of money going towards topics that often get pushed back because of questionable scientific foundations. And I think that's a particularly useful point too, because we see there's a lot of interesting data coming out from Pew and from Gallup and from other groups that's kind of articulating and showing over time how we're seeing declining levels of trust along ideological lines among Americans. So lower levels of trust in universities, science, scientists. And so if these institutions are doubling down and kind of increasing time and effort and resources toward ideologically charged topics, it's probably going to exacerbate those gaps in ways that aren't helpful or aren't useful. We see DEI being rapidly adopted in universities with diversity trainings, implicit bias trainings, bias prevention, DEI statements for faculty hiring and promotion. We're even seeing this for graduate admissions, kind of as a part of admissions to graduate programs, having to write a statement on what you think about diversity or how you've worked with diverse groups. And for me, that starts sending off warning flags like, okay, if you're asking these questions, I think oftentimes, like Luana mentioned, that it's not like we don't want racism in the academy. We want to make sure that the academy is inclusive. But when you're using politically charged topics, it could serve as a dog whistle for like certain viewpoints here are welcome and other viewpoints might not be, because as I've often seen, as I've done research and writing and stuff related to this, is diversity is typically defined in one or two ways. It's defined perhaps as variety, so including people from all sorts of different walks of life, kind of plurality, or it's defined as making effort toward welcoming and providing maybe special benefits toward groups that those who are more progressive might consider deserving of special protections. And with these two definitions, you see a very broad conceptualization and a very narrow conceptualization. And often an issue with DEI is that when the rubber hits the road to implement DEI initiatives, it's disingenuous because the rhetoric surrounding it uses very broad definitions. Like, we welcome anybody from all these different backgrounds and viewpoints and experiences. But then when like faculty are evaluating a DEI statement, usually they're looking for the more narrow and specific conceptualizations of DEI. And it's one of those things, all right, if I had to submit a DEI statement for this job at this university, people just know there's certain things like, all right, well, maybe I've done a lot of work to include students from rural communities that typically don't go to universities. And I mean, that would be something that I would classify as being a good effort related to diversity. But I think many institutions, that's not fitting in the categories of dealing with race, ethnicity, gender. It's probably something that is going to be penalized. So in my own work, I've started to dig into this a little bit to see how faculty evaluate and perceive DEI statements. And most faculty that I've surveyed believe that DEI, like diversity, equity, inclusion, these are important variables to consider in hiring. They don't think DEI statements threaten academic freedom, but at the same time, many think that they're political litmus tests, that they're mechanisms for signaling progressive political values. And I think this corresponds well to the data from the report, because we're seeing increased usage of these terms on university websites, university social media accounts. So then it kind of corresponds to, well, increased use because faculty think they're important. But kind of drilling down into the specifics and some of the preliminary studies I've conducted, when it comes to evaluating them, even though most of the time diversity is defined very broadly, if you don't have the right type of DEI statement, I've seen that statements that kind of talk about non-traditional forms of diversity receive a clear evaluative penalty from faculty evaluators. And these penalties are often harsher, in particular towards statements that talk about efforts related to viewpoint diversity or increasing ideological diversity. And if you have these statements being used as a screening tool or a screening device, that even becomes more concerning. It's possible that as DEI becomes more institutionalized, these things might become better refined, better articulated, but at the same time, it could also just continue to be more effective at weeding out nonconformists because of, at least at present, it kind of resides in a legal gray area, perhaps. So I'll just kind of close here with a couple comments about, so what do we do about it? This report is some great research on it. I think we need more research. Are these diversity trainings effective? How do DEI statements affect hiring practices? Do universities that focus on DEI and kind of talk about it a lot in their social media and on their websites, do these universities actually produce better scholars or more well-rounded students that can be more productive or effective communicators out in broader society? I think that could be an interesting point of comparison. I think in many ways it would be useful to push back and dial back the current implementation of DEI. This can be done by precisely defining it in broader ways, providing assurances that those who hold non-traditional views on DEI aren't going to be penalized. When it comes to using these for faculty, evaluating faculty for hiring or promotion, making them optional instead of mandatory, not using rubrics, not using it as a screening device. But I think DEI, it's very easy to kind of put these in the boogeyman category because of how they're often used. But I think they started as a very benevolent enterprise, and things that just we can't immediately write off as being bad. We need to run away from it. And I think given what this report shows of how prevalent it is in universities, it's not something that we're going to be able to back away from anytime soon. But I think it'd be helpful to have some good conversations around, like, okay, if this is here, what sort of balance can we strike between removing obstacles for those that have been excluded from the academy, while at the same time embracing pluralism and rejecting political discrimination and censorship, which I know that's a very tough combination. But the good things in life rarely are easy. So I'll just go ahead and wrap up there.
Thanks very much, Nathan. So we've got several questions lined up, but I wanted to give Mason a chance to respond to Luana's and Nathan's comments, and also Luana and Nathan to respond to each other's comments as well. So Nathan, why don't you go first?
I don't think I have anything additional to throw in at the moment. I tried to incorporate a little related to what Luana mentioned. So I'll hold off further till Q&A time.
Okay.
I have one thing I forgot to mention, which is about grants. And I wonder if there would be a way. So we see this dramatic increase in grants that are funded with DEI terms. What we don't know is if they were funded because of DEI or because there has just been a dramatic increase in all grants. So all grants now feel that they must put DEI stuff in their broader impact, which is what I'm perceiving, right? When I am writing grants with other people, definitely everybody's saying, oh, what are we gonna do to say our outreach? What are we gonna do? So perhaps the increase in funding in DEI terms, not because NIH and SF stopped funding science and are now funding DEI related stuff, but simply because all scientists now put some terms related to broader impacts. There are DEI terms, but that doesn't increase the costs of the grant. Typically, much of the broader impact are not more costly. It's just like, I am going to teach this course, I am going to reach out to all students and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if there is a way of actually answering this question. Like, is there a way? But I imagine that the submitted grants are not public, the ones that were not funded. Or is there a way of answering this question, whether there has just been an increase overall, just that reflects the increase in funded?
Yeah, I can offer some perspective on that. I've been involved in some large-scale grant competitions in which we have been told if you don't satisfy our criteria on diversity, equity, inclusion, and these are again to come back to Nathan's point, you know, they're very pretty words, but they're often defined down to effectively be one thing. I mean, we've been told that you can forget about being awarded this grant if you don't satisfy those criteria. And I don't think it's an explicit requirement yet, but the implication is very strong from NSF that your broader impact statement should include that. But Mason, what did you have some? Well, actually, Nathan or Mason, do you have a response to what Luana has pointed out?
Yeah, I'd have to go and check into that. Probably have to parse through some of the raw data to find out. But I'm also not entirely sure that it would matter so much, because if DEI is being forced down their throats, right? I think that may be almost more problematic than having a large cohort of researchers who are actually doing this work. I think it would be worse if it was simply like what Dr. Turner described, where you have to do this in order to get a legitimate grant, right? Because that becomes more problematic when you have scientists that are being essentially forced to adhere to a particular political ideology, and most commonly a rather pernicious one where everything is about power. When you have scientists doing that, it will eventually erode public trust. I'd much rather have a cohort of postmodern scholars receiving funds at higher levels than I would legitimate scientists bowing down to these orders. Because the former, at least, we can all laugh at them and say, well, this is a waste of money. The latter actually affects public trust going forward. So, and then to Nate's point, I understand the predicament. You know, these are pretty words. It seems like a broad umbrella for a very narrow handle, where and I think in my conversations with people, that's been the case. Is there are a lot of individuals who are passively supporting this, and they haven't stopped to ask themselves, what is in these books that are being promoted by these DEI officers? You know, they sound good, they have good titles, they judge the books by their cover, as we all probably did at some point, and they haven't stopped to think critically about this. And I've learned that if you sit them down for about 10 to 15 minutes and walk them through a few online articles, their eyes are opened almost immediately. So, you know, I'm sympathetic to that, where on one hand, this sounds good, and it might have the potential to actually be good, but by and large, it just isn't at the moment. So I think that's about it.
Someone who's posted a comment in the chat section that is germane to this. Ed Geringer says, my experience is that panels and program directors can see through, quote, broader impact statements with cameo mentions of DEI terms. And that's certainly a very hopeful thing to say. But any response to that? Response to that? So yeah, this is one of these hard things to quantify. You know, you have all the heat and light going on with these controversies over imposing DEI requirements, but then you have the claim from many working scientists that, oh well, you know, we don't pay any attention to that. We bend our knee and just to show that we're going along with this, but at the end of the day, we end up just going back and doing sciences. And of course, the flip side of that is that you've had several prominent scientists lately. Lawrence Krauss was one of them who all of a sudden find themselves in a position where their ability to do science is compromised, and they're quite surprised and outraged by it. And so I'm not sure, you know, whose experience is more germane to how we shape science, the role of DEI in how we do science and things like this. So so the question is, the insiders, they know what they're doing. It's no problem. Calm down, everyone. And then you have many prominent people like Lawrence Krauss, for example, or the eponymously named Etienne Forrest, who just published something recently in Stack, a particle accelerator physicist, who also was kind of surprised and outraged by what he saw going on around him. So any thoughts about that? I mean, have you experienced people who are surprised and kind of outraged by how the culture of science is being changed by this whole push?
I certainly have, and to respond to Ed's comment, I think that the people who say that they can see through this and it's just calm down, this is all boilerplate, I don't think they're thinking far enough ahead in the future, because they're teaching their graduate students and eventually the undergraduates as well that, well, we'll just lie and it'll be fine. But that's actually how societies become corrupt, is one lie, just a step at a time. You do that for a generation or two in the universities, and things are going to go bad. It's already started to leak out into corporate America. I mean, there's been pushback, but we have large corporations that are flagrantly violating anti-discrimination laws in the name of DEI, right? And that's happening at the universities tenfold. But I think the people that are saying, "Oh, well, just calm down," we're just bending the knee for now, they're not thinking far enough ahead, because all it takes is one lie, a little step at a time, and things will go corrupt within 10 to 15 years. So.
You'll be pleased to know that Ed Geringer, who posed that question, put up a follow-up chat, says, "I agree with you on that, Mason." So that clarifies that. Luana, what's your experience been with your fellow scientists? Are they surprised by the intrusion of this ideology into their fields?
It's certainly a mix. I think that there are many people who think this is a good thing, and that good things will come out of it, or think that it's nothing. We're just, and many who often are not as vocal about it are pretty surprised. And I teach at a small liberal arts college, not research intense, and I think that the most surprising change has been the change in grading policies and the dramatic increase in alternative grading methods that basically guarantee that everybody gets an A. So there is ungrading, there is contract grading. Your students sign a contract saying if they come to every class, turning every homework, they get an automatic A-. That's one method. The change also in, I suppose, culture, like in the past, a teacher that had a tough class that students would say they learned a lot but was really hard and very few people got A's would be considered an excellent teacher. And nowadays I've seen many people saying that, that the reason they are personally an excellent teacher is because all of their students get A's. So they all learned 100%. Which everybody knows it's very easy to write an exam that everybody gets an A in the exam and nobody learned anything. So it's interesting to see this changing, like a good professor is the one that challenges the students to, a good professor is the one that includes all students and everybody feels nice and having fun at the class or these kinds of stuff. So that's the main thing I've been observing around me.
And I'd like to add on to that, because I'm at 24 years old. I'm probably the youngest person on this call, I think, right? So from the student's perspective, I like it when the professors challenge you and we have open debates in class. I enjoyed those. The University of North Georgia is a small mountain college, and I was not aware of what was going on in the universities until I got to George Mason University and saw it firsthand. And it was a total culture shock in ways that I won't get into here. It's a long story, but you know, it was just amazing to me from a student's perspective to be paying tuition dollars to go to class thinking, wow, these are not credentials that I can actually be proud of. And increasingly talking to employers and going to places and coming to the realization that as a student, I was paying for credentialing. That was it. We weren't learning anything, right? I've learned more in my close to first year here with the NAS in terms of coding and books that I've read than I did in 2 years of graduate school, which is a pretty sad fact in hindsight, right? I mean, really. But that's how it is. And speaking as a student's perspective. So
yeah, Nathan, you've been at FIRE for just a short time, so you may not be you may not have been as fully immersed in this to give us a deep answer on it. I'm not trying to belittle you, but there is this, you know, FIRE is supposed to be the place where scholars of all stripes, scientists included, appeal when they feel like their academic freedom or their freedom to teach or whatever is being violated. And we had a follow-up comment here on the chat about PhD students and how they're all fully woke and we all have to give up, and now we fear the students rather than teach them. So what kinds of things come into FIRE then that would shed light on this issue? You know, are science faculty being caught by surprise by this and shocked by their academic freedom being infringed? Have you got comments from students or appeals from students that they feel intimidated or they feel threatened by traditional professors? You know, what kinds of things have you found in your time at FIRE so far?
So I will say, kind of, given that I haven't been at FIRE for too long and that DEI is new, there hasn't been a ton that I've seen yet. And I do think it's tricky. So particularly in the context of like DEI statements for faculty hiring, as with most suits related to discrimination in hiring, it's difficult to pinpoint like, okay, if I wasn't hired for this position, it's because my DEI statement was not the right type, and that's why. That kind of stuff is a bit tricky to get at. I can give some comments related to just the environment in the academy, since I recently kind of finished up my PhD program. Coming from the social sciences, social psychology background, social scientists are kind of some of the main proponents of DEI stuff and pushing it and advancing it. So it's very popular there. But what I have seen in my field, kind of some people saying, wait a minute, we need to pause here and take a step back, perhaps, with DEI being implemented in professional societies. So one such case was the society, SPSP, Society for Personalities. I get these acronyms mixed up. SPSP, requiring DEI related statements for conference proposals and presentations. And so that has led a number of scholars to be like, okay, wait a minute, diversity, equity, inclusion, these are good things, but why is that relevant for evaluating the merits of a research study that I conducted and whether or not it should be presented at this conference? So are you adding, by using this stuff, are you adding another layer of evaluation criteria to this? So if I did a good study, are you saying that because I didn't from the onset tie it into diversity related concepts, or if my research team wasn't diverse enough, or my participant sample wasn't diverse enough, that this study isn't valid anymore? So I think that's led some people to, in my field, to take a step back and pause. Yeah, but when it comes to FIRE stuff, it's kind of, the stuff is still working its way through the system. I would encourage anybody who's interested in FIRE's position. They have put out a couple of statements about diversity, equity, inclusion statements for faculty hiring and the kind of the various concerns that FIRE has related to that and related to free speech and academic freedom issues.
Yeah. A comment has come in from Andre Znamenetsky. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Andre. Will it be helpful to dramatize the whole issue to compare the DEI nonsense in the sciences, presently I'm gathering, with Aryan science in Nazi Germany and Lysenkoism in Stalinist Soviet Union, to add these lines to introductory science classes? That's an important issue because the accusation has been made that DEI is doing this. I'm not sure we can address it here, but I would just point out that Heterodox STEM, the Substack account, has had a number of interesting articles lately on this. One related to the parallels between what happened during the purge of Jews in the 1930s by a Israeli historian of science, Ute Deichmann. Just to give a plug, he'll be a guest on our Restoring the Sciences webinar in January. And then Anna Krylov wrote a very interesting heterodox STEM essay called From Russia with Love, precisely about this whole issue of ideological penetration into the sciences using Lysenkoism as an example. So do any of you have anything to respond to that? It's an important question. But Andre, I would subscribe to Heterodox STEM. There's some fascinating stuff being done there. But any thoughts from you guys on that?
Yeah, I can take it up. I think it would be helpful for those who understand the historic narrative of this. Of course, part of the problem with making these comparisons is that if the person you're talking to is ignorant of the history, well, then you have to explain all the history, and it's not exactly helpful. But in one aspect, I actually think the current situation may be worse, because those groups were saying this is the correct way to do science, and the applied postmodernists are saying, well, actually the scientific method is this cultural construct of the cis-abled, able-bodied, heterosexual European male, and every other identity group have their own methodologies. That's how they're going to do science. If you want to see something really wild, look up erotic methods at MIT, and you'll get a good idea of what I'm talking about. So I think that the actual situation is worse, because even under the Nazis and under Stalin, there was nonsense going on, sure, and it was being forced down people's throats, but they still made progress. There's no denying that, right? And today, there's no progress to be made because the methods that are being taught, or at least promoted, cannot function, right? So it's actually worse. And moreover, it won't help the minorities that it purports to. So consider that.
Luana or Nathan?
I don't have much to add. I mean, Lysenkoism was a disaster too. It made no progress. It led to the starvation of millions. And I think that, I don't know if I'm reading the question correctly, but I think that talking about that in a 101 science class is no good. First, most students don't realize that things have changed. They have been immersed in this, and they do not know the past. They don't know that what this means in practice, that some of the methods being implemented can be detrimental to the very cause that they say they are helping. So the students don't know that. So if we start comparing this at this level, they're just going to think we were crazy or think the worst of you. So I think that in terms of including that in classrooms at the level of undergraduate education makes no sense whatsoever. But at a graduate student, like higher level, depending that maybe, but yeah, but and of course, I think efforts like Anna Krylov, like writing about her experiences in the Soviet Union and how that compares to here, for people who are interested in the area and concern, I think that's very helpful, but not in a classroom.
Yeah, you very easily fall into Godwin's law, that whole thing that you know, the minute you bring up Hitler, you've lost the argument, you know, and that's true. It is a trivial and cheap thing to do. I think I'm not saying that Andre has said that, but that's the way it's often brought out in practice, and that's boils down to basically, as you say, Luana, the ignorance of the audience that you're trying to talk about. And I would agree, it would be trouble to talk about this in a freshman biology class, but it's even trouble to talk about it in a graduate class, you know. And I think part of that is that science students don't learn history, you know. So anyway, so let's Brian Falkman has an interesting one. He says, we can hope the newest explosions of DEI are a passing fade like power posing, but I'm not optimistic. The investments in institutional bureaucracy are large and mounting, which is certainly true. And here's my question. What evidence does this report reveal that DEI is becoming financially entrenched in the halls of science? I see the trends in NIH and NSF grants worrying, but not quite the same as direct evidence that increased grant awards is the result of programmatic changes in the funding agencies. I'm presuming towards including DEI and diversity statements in there. So to what extent has this dug itself in to the point that it's going to be almost impossible to turf out?
I'm not exactly sure what direct evidence the report offers, but I certainly think that with the amount of time and attention that's being spent on it, would lead one to at least reasonably assume that DEI is becoming financially entrenched into the university structure. That said, I can speak to my personal experiences before I left George Mason, where it was very clear that if the administration of the schools wanted to keep their funding, they had to comply with the central administration of the university. Central administration of the university was looking out towards the grant bodies, the federal government, the state government, and so on. And it was just too top down. You know, Dr. Turner, we've written about the big science cartel. It felt almost like that. And so if DEI ideology becomes the ideology of big science, then it becomes absolutely unescapable. Now, I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look really carefully. I'm not sure the report offers any evidence of that, but it seems that way to me.
Luana or Nathan?
I think that could be a fantastic additional question for kind of in my part. I talked about future research. I think this could be a great future research question. I don't know if the data in this kind of in the repository from this study would be able to answer that directly from my reading of the report, but I think that could be a very useful point of information to have is, all right, here we see an increase in funding related to this, but now how entrenched is it? Is this funding long-term or not? What are some of the hard dollar amounts behind it?
Yeah, and you know, certainly there's been some interesting and troubling trends. You know, everyone talks about administrative bloat, for example, and that's one of the main things driving tremendous inflation in college costs, and then you can correlate that with well, who are all these new administrators, and they're often in DEI bureaucracies, and of course the entrenchment part comes in. These are often very highly paid administrators who have considerable amount of power and you know, and sway over now the academic side of what we do at universities. So Luana, you probably don't want to answer this question, but what's the expansion of the DEI bureaucracy been like at Williams?
I don't have numbers. I mean, there definitely, since I came, there has definitely been an expansion. And I think as more people get hired, they will find work to do, right? So one novelty that got introduced a few years ago, and I don't think it got repeated this year, is that the DEI was training our science TAs. So the DEI department was offering TA training. And as part of the training, for example, they were basically teaching language purity, if you will, like words that cannot be said. And one word that was shocking to me to see there was the word guys. You could not refer to students as, hey guys, okay guys. Now, which is a word that I say all the time. I don't know how to use these other terms. I use guys all the time. And by teaching the students that, you basically create a snowball effect where they now perceive a word that might have been completely benign before. Now they perceive it as an aggression, a microaggression. So they're going to walk out of that class, let's say, because I say guys, feeling that the professor is not inclusive or something like that. And that leads to a person ever more feeling more victimized. So it's another one of these strategies that lead up hurting rather than helping with inclusivity efforts, right? As you teach students that ever less meaningful stuff are actually aggressions that they have to watch out for, they will feel ever more victimized, ever less included, and therefore less able to function in the university realm. So it's one more of these strategies that you may think that they're helpful, but they are extremely hurtful. And I see that happening at the local schools as well, including like hiring, like my local public school here is hiring their first DEI director. You know, so these bureaucracy is getting entrenched, not just at the level of university, but everywhere in society, and leading to these kinds of efforts like language purity, that everything is an aggression, and therefore people feel really bad. I mean, when you imagine yourself walking in a campus, right, waving to someone, the person not waving back, instead of thinking that the person didn't see you, you think that they didn't recognize you because of who you are. And especially people that can claim some kind of victim, LGBTQ or minority or whatnot, it's really taxing, and they're teaching that. So it's a terrible strategy.
Nathan? Thoughts?
I think nothing additional to add to Luana now.
Okay, all right. I mean, talking about the climate, this is one of Bruce Folkman's comments, is that faculty actually kind of fear their students and vocal and negative reactions. I'm not sure it's all that widespread, but I do think it's real. And of course, the question is, what do these diversity trainings and orientations do to actually improve the campus climate, which I think touches on your point, Luana. So let's have a look at some of the other questions. G. Kissel, he asks, did the author or co-author of this report stumble upon any evidence of violations of university non-discrimination policies? And there are some other things in here, some other questions. Is this a Title 9 or Title 6, Title 7 or Title 6 violation of any institutions? And of course, this is kind of a big question, you know, if we're going to define diversity as ethnic diversity or sexual diversity, and we're going to have these de facto narrow definitions of what the diversity means. This is germane to your point, Nathan. Where do we verge over into the illegality of this kind of policy? I mean, it can seem almost illegally discriminatory, totally contradictory to the civil rights law of 1964.
Not being a lawyer, so I hesitate to speak to the legality of it, but yeah. I would say that so given that a lot of what I've studied is how faculty evaluate diversity statements for hiring, there is significant risk that these are compelling certain types of speech, that they could be operating as a political litmus test, particularly when they ask for faculty to speak to their views on diversity issues as opposed to their actions. It's particularly problematic when these requirements come from the administration rather than the faculty themselves. Not that faculty can just wish away their free speech or academic freedom rights either, but it's more problematic when it comes from the administration. So on the legal end, I'm not sure if these are, I can't really speak to if they're violations of Title VI or Title IX. But it's like, part of me wants to say, like, I hope this can be litigated in some way, but at the same time, like, if it's being litigated, then obviously that means like somebody was negatively impacted and that's not a good experience. But in many ways, I think a lot of this isn't going to be resolved until we have different cases like that can get at it, or unless different states or the government decides to step in with legislation or bills that would speak into and give some clarity to this.
Yeah, you can bet that universities are lawyered up on this big time to make sure that they don't step over. But of course, we'll all be very interested to see how the Supreme Court rules on the case against Harvard for the Asian students I think it's Asian Students for Fair Admissions. I think that's the name of it. There were a couple of comments that came in on the question and answer about this idea that when you're crafting a DEI statement or talking about broader impacts with relation to DEI, that, well, we'll just say something and then we'll get through the grant thing and we'll have our money and we can carry on with what we're supposed to be doing. So here's one from Paul Sanders. The quote, "Let's all just lie" proposal has the goal of setting up quote, "unearned guilt," unquote, in the liars and the wider culture which the DEI tyrants will use to build a culture of guilty liars who can be pushed around to do any horrible thing in the future. It's a troubling perspective, but it's one that I think we should be worried about. So, there is this idea that scientists, which have always kind of prided themselves on being independent thinkers, explorers of the endless frontier, and all this kind of thing, are sort of being turned into serfs, if you will, under a tyrannical administrative. I'm talking about university administrative bureaucracy. So, at what point do you take a stand then and push back? And why haven't more scientists taken a stand?
I'll take that. I'll start with the second question. Why don't more scientists take a stand? I would say it's mostly because a lot of the people in STEM excel at nonverbal reasoning. They tend to be rather mathematically inclined. And I've had discussions with people like this where I've spoken with one engineer and for instance, who just said straight out that he and his colleagues they're upset about this, they're worried about this, they do not understand the political philosophy behind this, they have no idea where it's coming from, and they really just don't have the competencies yet to articulate the criticisms against them, because they're mathematical people and they're experts at that. And so the DEI, the postmodern types, I was watching, I think Dr. Peterson had said once that he had seen this coming, where these postmodern types would just cut through the STEM fields like a hot knife on butter. I think that's true. And I think that the postmodern DEI types can do that simply because the STEM people have no interest in history, or they don't have any interest in political philosophy. It's not what they're doing. And so the DEI people immediately have an advantage, the element of surprise, we might say. In terms of when is it time to to push back, I'd say, I would say that the question is, the moment that the question arises in your head is when you should push back. Because if you're trying to wait for the opportune moment, you're not guaranteed to ever get it, so make a case. There are more people who support you than you think. I mean, I remember when I walked away from the Shar School at George Mason, one of the professors there actually wrote me a thank you note. And I know that this person was certainly not conservative by any means, right? And had written me a thank you note. So there are more people that support you than you think that will come out of the woodwork to do so.
So Luana, you're rather renowned for taking a stand. When do you think the time to take a stand is? What prompted you to take the stand that you did?
Well, I started writing on the student newspaper at the college when things became a little too crazy around here. I think when you realize that things are definitely affecting your college, your field. Now, the problem, of course, is that it is very time consuming. And I think a lot of scientists are so embedded in their work, they don't want to spend the time. And they just prefer to ignore, and they think it's going to go away. It's just a blip. There is that traditional, the pendulum will swing back. It's just a matter of waiting a bit. Things will go back to normal. And I think it, as I mentioned before, like each person has their own moment where they realize that things have gone too far. For me, it was when we had like an invited speaker talk, Reza Aslam, and he said that rules had to be written on every campus, every university and college about what can and cannot be said. And the students stood up in standing ovation. And for me, that was the moment where I saw we were living through crazy times. And but like each person will have that moment at some point, and then that's the moment to start trying to do something.
Yeah, I've heard it said in the past couple months that we all remember the exact moment when we realized that something was seriously wrong. And yeah.
Nathan, you FIRE, I'm sure has a lot of people coming in who decided to maybe take a stand and have been punished for it by their universities. Have you run across any of those in the short time you've been there?
I haven't. No, I'm kind of a research wonk, kind of just deep in the data. I would say if anybody does run into situations where they speak up on these issues and they face retaliation, like please do reach out to FIRE. There's various links on the website where will lead to forums to do that. So please do that. I will say I recognize for academics that it is a tricky decision to make. Like if you face a situation where like, okay, I'm being asked to submit this statement, or I'm being asked to sign this letter or get on board with this. Like, okay, do I say no and face like losses of career opportunities because I'm not going to engage in this and maybe face retaliation? Do I play the game and submit something that's disingenuous? Or do I submit something that doesn't play the game, but then face retaliation because I didn't submit the right kind of stuff? So there's a lot of, it's difficult, but I do think sometimes we overestimate or the amount of retaliation we might experience. So it's kind of one of those, you just have to know your colleagues and trust and hope that you have some friends that will be there to support you. I think Jonathan Katz, I think that's the fellow from Princeton. He's talked a little bit about that and with the issues that he faced there, just the importance of friendships and having a good network of people that will be there to support you. And I mean, that's good advice for many things beyond this, of course.
Yeah.
But it is tricky.
Yeah, George Lee has helpfully clarified the name of the group bringing the lawsuit against Harvard. It's Students for Fair Admissions, and he has also some helpful links some helpful links related to that. Here's a question: how does DEI in STEM affect the way the public interacts with science and the regulations that rely on those findings? I'm guessing this is for things like environmental regulation, workplace regulation, and so forth. But to carry on, like all things today, does DEI in STEM contribute to the public distrust in expertise? And that's kind of a big thing right now. A big topic of conversation on the right is the death of expertise. You know, people don't trust experts anymore. So can we address that question?
Sure. I think it contributes significantly. Anytime that that science or scholarship really it becomes politicized, where it's just activism, that it's not good for public's trust, and you should distrust it. But when that activism becomes part of the university's policy, right, where in order to get funding you have to engage in this, in order to advance your career you have to engage in this, that tears apart public trust completely. Now I'm sure the right wing has done that before too. Currently it's coming from the universities almost completely, and that's one of the things that's interesting as I've sort of stepped out of national security into this is I've seen so many people who 7-8 years ago would have been center left, who say, I remember the times it was the creationist and religious coalitions that came after evolutionary biology and things like that. It's like, things have changed completely, where we went from that within a decade and now we're saying, oh, well, evolution's or even the scientific method itself isn't real. That's just a power construct, gone so far off the rails. But.
So Nathan, you've been immersed in this whole issue of not necessarily public trust in science, but you're probably conversant with some of the tools that people use to gauge public trust and public opinion and those sorts of things. What sorts of things have you run across in related to public trust in science?
Yeah, kind of, as I mentioned earlier, I have seen a variety of data points showing that public trust in science, scientists, universities is declining, particularly along ideological lines. So those on the right are more distrusting of universities, scientists. So it would be in the benefit of institutions to be very careful with things like this, because the public, through their tax dollars, supports public institutions. And politicians, they in some ways have sway over NIH funding and other large federal grant programs. And so if they perceive these institutions as pursuing very biased enterprises in their studies, then what incentive would there be to continue funding this in any way? Yeah. I had another thought. I lost it. If Luana has any comments, I might remember it by the time she's done.
Luana?
I think that the general public doesn't know the extent that this is happening or any of this. They have no clue. Now, I think that what hurts science is when you start to have like groups like even my scientific society and others saying things like, sexes are not binary, there is a whole spectrum and things like that, which are obviously wrong. I mean, we all have learned at some point, most people have, at least until recently, that sexes are defined by gamete type, and there are two types, large gametes, small gametes, nothing in between. And when they start to complicate that by broken chromosomes or whatnot, sexes are not even defined by chromosomes, they're determined by chromosomes in mammals, in turtles, they're determined by temperature, for example. And then this confusion gets, and then someone speaks out, and you can see like these fights going on in the public realm and Twitter, and that's when trust falls, I think. And these are largely pushed by DEI ideals of inclusion, for example, which are misplaced ideals once again, but the idea that to be inclusive of LGBTQ, you have to say that in nature, binary sexes do not exist. So that's one thing that makes people lose trust in science.
Yeah.
I remember the other thing I wanted to mention. There's been a kind of renewed interest or resurgence in attention towards the idea of institutional neutrality. I think something like that could be of great benefit to universities when dealing with contentious issues such as diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever else may come up. If you have kind of a policy that says, hey, as an institution and as leaders of this institution, we're not going to speak into every issue of the day. We're going to allow these to be adjudicated in the scholarship that researchers do and other academic writing, publications and whatnot. We're going to let this place be a forum for any and all ideas, because kind of get into the free speech aspects, like, okay, today it might be that the right is more interested in topics related to free speech and protecting it, but 50 years ago it was the left, and in 50 years in the future it might be the left again. So you're not trying to protect these different values and principles necessarily because you need them to defend you right now, but because everybody needs them and you might need them at some point.
Yeah. Well, we're approaching the end of our time. I apologize if we haven't got to everyone's question. There are a lot of really interesting ones there. If you have questions that you'd like answered by any of the panelists, please send them along to us here at National Association of Scholars. But before we go into our closing statements, there is one, as not so much a question as maybe a plea or a nugget for thought. And this is from Mark Roberts, Dr. Mark Roberts. He asks, what hope have we that DEI proponents in power will take seriously such empirical evidence? And that's, I think, the crux of this report. You know, this is the empirical evidence, and you know, what are we going to do with it? All right, so I'd just like to give everyone a chance to reflect on what we've just done, a couple of minutes, closing statements. So let's start with you, Nathan.
Sure. Maybe for my closing statement, I'll kind of address what Dr. Roberts mentioned. One thing that I've found, or that I've thought a lot about related to this or just any other research that might be semi-controversial but important, is to get people to take seriously the evidence. Sometimes you just have to continue producing more evidence until there's so much that it becomes essentially impossible to ignore. So studies like the report presented today, this is fantastic. And the more that we can continue producing that's similar to this, or experimental evidence, surveys of attitudes, I think that will help build a strong case and a strong set of data that policymakers perhaps can use, that faculty in their departments that are serving on committees that are thinking through these things, or university committees, they can say, hey, here's all this data, and it's not just this one-off small sample study conducted with this limited sample. Like, no, here's a nice large scholarship that we can point to that can provide evidence-based solutions to how we should move forward. So the more we can produce in that area, I think the more difficult it would be to ignore.
Thanks, Nathan. Luana, your thoughts?
I fully agree. I think that the more we can inform the public as well, and for universities, the alums, like the free speech alliances that are appearing at a fast pace, this is a great way to inform alums about what's going on and to push back, because they are the strength. Like, if they start to be concerned and not donate money, then that's when universities will turn on their strategy. So getting more people to know what's going on, like by getting more information, more press, etc. That's our hope.
And Nathan, Mason, final word goes to you.
So I will. Dr. Roberts asked, what hope have we that the DEI proponents in power will take seriously such empirical evidence? I would say none. Absolutely none, because the DEI proponents in power are the ones who care only for power. That is at the root of their political philosophy under that umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But like what Luana was saying, the best thing to do is to get other people to take it seriously, the people who control the funding, the people who control the attention, and get those people to take it seriously. And then the DEI proponents in power will begin to take you seriously, because they will realize that they are going to lose their grip if they do not either shape up and start acting properly, or just completely. So it can't be a direct strategy.
Okay, well, this is the end of our time together. I'd like to thank all of you, Nathan, Luana, and Mason, for joining us tonight. Mason, congratulations on that report. And to everyone who came, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them, but this will be available online on YouTube very shortly after that. And on that note, on behalf of the National Association of Scholars, I will bid you all good day.